2014, a lot of us here in Alaska involved, but all across the nation, conservatives were reacting to the Obama administration and the increase of socialism. And that's effectively what it is, right? And what did we do? We had what was called a wave election, where we elected significant majorities to the House, and of course, for the first time in a number of years, a majority to the US Senate. And everybody expected, just as the politicians proclaimed when they were running for office, that we were going to roll back the Obama agenda. Did that happen? No. It didn't. In fact, we had, by hook, crook, and otherwise, we had the Republicans actually join hands with the Democrats and put through Obama's amnesty and also funding of Obamacare. Two things, both of which could have been stopped. The House controls the appropriations. There's certainly the numbers in the House, and yet it didn't happen. Now, there were some patriots there, right? We had 25 that voted against Boehner, and out of the 425 that are there, that sounds like just a small number. And it is a small number, but it was the biggest number in, what, 100 years to vote against the Speaker? And had they just had a handful more, they would have had enough with the Democrats to actually have defeated Boehner and gone into another election, perhaps with a more conservative Speaker, who knows. But, we've had a number of people, I've been blessed with a radio show, we've had a number of great guests, and this is not to pump Joe Miller's show, but there are a number of people that we've had on that are really, I think, attuned with what's going on in the country. Congressman Massey was on just a few days ago, and he talked about this whole deal with Boehner. And, I'll talk a little bit about the retaliation, but first about what led up to that vote. I mean, there are a number of people that felt so committed to making the changes that they were elected to do, that they voted against Boehner, and they're willing to take the hit in doing so. And they knew that there would be significant consequence. Initially, of course, Boehner said, I'm not going to penalize and retaliate against anybody that votes against me.
Right. Yeah.
And of course, that goes completely against what he had done in the past with people like my friend Representative Huelskamp out of Kansas, who got stripped of his appropriations position because of what he had done sometime before. And of course, he was one of the 25 again who voted against Boehner. But there was retaliation, and we heard that, of course, the funding. We put up an article last week on Restoring Liberty about that. A lot of these rebels that went out there now are getting no money. Massey, for example, got $1,000 from a single PAC in this election cycle. Of course, it's not done yet, compared to the 48 or 50,000 that he raised the cycle before that. So the establishment has basically said, do not fund these rebels. We're going to find people to replace them. And of course, that's a scary thought for a lot of people, because not always do you just have a grassroots reaction to your campaign. You need some funding in order to compete on the airwaves. And there may be consequence to a number of these people because of how elections happen. And it's demoralizing. And it's especially demoralizing when you see Boehner join hands with the Democrats in order to get the funding for Obama's administration. And that's what happened, of course, on the amnesty and on the Obamacare. And so a lot of people are talking, what do we do? Because we've got these Republicans that we elect, we get these wave elections, and they continue to do exactly what big government does. It doesn't matter whether it's Republican or Democrat. And I was talking to Jim about this morning, about what we're going to talk about. He said, well, it's like a bend in the road, Joe. What direction are we going to go? We've seen where we've gone. We can see where we're going. What choice are we going to take in the future? And, for us in the Alaska Republican Assembly, we all, at least I think, it's still required for membership to be a Republican, right, David?
Yes.
Although there's an associate membership for those who aren't.
Yes, we're starting an associate membership for those who are Ls and Us that want to volunteer and be involved in committees. It's just a non-voting. You have to be Republican to vote.
Well, in that area right now, I mean, there's a continuing shift in the country today. And there's not a day that doesn't go by, it seems, that we don't have somebody either commenting at Restoring Liberty or commenting at the radio show about, I'm no longer a Republican, I'm just done with the party, I'm going a different direction. And that's one of the big debates right now, is what do we do as members of the Republican Party? Do we have the ability to actually leverage the party, to move it in the direction of the platform? I mean, the platform's great, if they just follow the platform. And a lot of people have reached the conclusion that it doesn't do us any good to do anything, because the ultimate end of it is, if we elect one of our own, they're going to fight us. If we elect one of them, they expect our vote, and they generally get it. It's not happening all over the country, but that's really the way it's headed. For the first time in at least recent political history, there are major candidates for office that are saying no more. And I'm going to talk about a subject that for some of you probably it might be a little bit disturbing. For the Alaska Republican Assembly, it should not be, because this is fundamental to the party platform and it's fundamental to conservative principles, and that's homosexual marriage. Homosexual marriage is a huge issue, folks, and it's driven people like Governor Huckabee to say publicly that if the Republican Party abandons on that issue, he's jumping ship. And that means, and that could have a major realignment effect in American politics if something like that happens. the Republican Party at the head of the leadership has made a strategic decision. This is a loser issue. They've looked at the polling data, they look at the newer generations, and let me tell you, I mean, most of us here, I'll hazard a guess, our average age is probably 40, and I don't mean to offend any younger ladies out here. The fact of the matter is, you know, we've got a generation that's not even here. But we need the younger people because that's the future. And you know, you talk to my son, for example. You know, we've attended church for the last, in Fairbanks, the longest we've been one place in our entire lives, since 2002, so 13 years. Evangelical church, you know, teaches the Bible. And he told me the other day, he said, you know, Dad, these people that I've gone to church with all my life, and now he's married, he's going on to medical school, Lord willing, this next year. He said, all these people that I've interacted with, gone to church with, have listened to the same word you and I have listened to in this church, all believe in gay marriage. Wow. Every one of them, without exception.
Wow. On that distinct point, you hear the latest polls, 60% of Americans are for gay marriage. Even Fox News, you know, and Megyn Kelly and those and people that I actually have some respect for have all said, you know, it's a done deal.
Right.
Where are these polls coming from? I think is the big question to me, because I don't know anybody that's for gay marriage.
Right.
Maybe I know I'm a little.
That's because you're so hardcore conservative, Mike. You don't interact with people with different views.
Yeah.
Now, you know, that's a very good point. And when I say that all these kids are for gay marriage, I really mean that. And I think the polling backs that up, and I think the anecdotal evidence is, you know, again, we don't want to base it on that, but at least in this state, it's overwhelming. I mean, everybody that I've talked to at a younger age, that's the case. At the older ages, you are absolutely correct. There has been an effort to basically snow everybody that this is something that the whole country has decided on. And they've used the media very effectively to do that as well. You can't you can't go to the theater today and see a movie that does not positively portray a homosexual relationship. Amen. It's the elites trying to shove it down your throat and say this is normal activity. If you don't believe in it, you're an outlier. And it's had tremendous impact on the younger generation. There's a study, Will and Grace. People that watched Will and Grace for 3 or 4 years, they could show empirically that all of their attitudes changed in a positive direction toward homosexual relationships. So the culture does have a dramatic impact on that.
My oldest son is 39, and he was the first to express what's the problem.
Right.
My 38-year-old son, and an Iraqi vet, and on, also Marine. They don't believe that there's an issue with it, but what they don't see and what they don't consider, they look at it from strictly a perspective of personal relationship. They do not understand what comes with it, which it never stops at the union, whether it's secular or what.
Right.
It always comes with an attempt to institute hate speech law, which is a violation of the first. It always comes with an attempt to create another privileged class, and then comes getting even.
Yeah.
It's all about getting even with Christianity, it really is. There's a war.
You made a perfect point, and that's where I was going to head, and that is that this thing that everybody thinks government just has got to stay out of, especially the younger generations, government has no role in it. It does not stop there. It goes far beyond that, and that's one of the reasons why, and you know, let me kind of back this up a little bit. Restoring Liberty, been out there since 2011. It's the top read political site in the state. One, it's been from the top 50, top 100 in the nation. It's been very impacted. And we look at what the stories get, you know, the most reads, get the most likes, are most popular. And historically, when we put up a story about homosexual marriage and the need for conservatives to speak out or the implications of it, they've had no responsiveness. And you know, the readership of this is a very conservative populace. Conservatives don't like the topic. They have not liked the topic, but it's changing. It's changing dramatically, especially given what's happened with the Supreme Court arguments on this issue. Because people are finally starting to realize, oh, this is not live and let live business. These folk are not going to stop until we're in jail or worse. There's a cardinal in Chicago who just died, wrote a column and said, I'm going to die in my bed, my successor is going to die in prison, and his successor is going to die a martyr in the public square in the United States of America. And it was based upon this conflict of mutually exclusive worldviews, effectively. Lance.
Yeah, do you want to mention the Supreme Court argument and the tax exemption?
Right, so we put up a story 2 days ago about this, and basically, you know, this is one of the other implications of this. All of you remember the Bob Jones University case, where Bob Jones had this repugnant policy of banning interracial marriage. And the Supreme Court, ultimately this ended up going to the Supreme Court, I believe, but there was an IRS determination that Bob Jones University could not be tax exempt because of this policy. And so the argument was posed at the Supreme Court level. What happens now with gay marriage being basically enshrined as a right, homosexuality? What are we going to do with those schools, those universities that say no to homosexuality? And of course, it even goes beyond that, it goes to the church. And the solicitor said, this is going to be a problem. That's a paraphrase, but he said, this is going to be a problem. Saying, they're even recognizing and admitting that the next steps are stripping away all the funding from these schools that stand for traditional values, and of course, implications to the church. Lots of churches have interaction with the federal government. Of course, I've got some arguments about that, but it's beyond that even. It's also the tax income status of churches. It's also ultimately compelling, perhaps, churches in leadership, churches that have other structures outside of them to comply with this concept that homosexuality is an enshrined right. If you, with your religious freedom, believe that it's not, you're going to be penalized. There's going to be a leverage or a compelling interest in making sure that you're penalized for it. So we're talking about schools. We're talking about not at the university level alone. We're talking about lower level schools. We're talking about what's happening now, of course, in Canada and other countries where if you speak out on the issue, you're in prison. This has engaged many in the conservative cause, unlike any other time. It's why Huckabee has said what he said. It's why other people have made the comments that they've made about this being a very important issue that we've got to engage on or we'll lose our freedom of speech especially.
Just a quick point. I travel to Europe quite often with my job, and in Europe, if you speak out against homosexual marriage or even speak out in favor of traditional marriage, you can lose your job, even if you're in the private sector.
Right.
It's considered a civil rights issue. So, and that's where we're headed here. If we don't stop this now, just saying that you support traditional marriage publicly is a crime.
Yeah.
So.
And that is where it's headed. There's no question about it. And the amazing thing, let me just squeeze one thing in here about going back to that younger generation. Steven Crowder, who's on our show every Friday, hilarious guy. He's a little bit uncouth and something, but he's great to have on because he's a different character. But very much engaged in the culture. And what he has done is gone around to the universities and talked to these kids about what they believe, what they think. And it's curious because he said, you know, Joe, it's not just this issue of them believing in homosexual marriage. It's also the issue of them believing that you should not have the right to speak out against these sacred cows. PC is a muck at the younger generation. They don't have a concept of the fundamental freedoms enshrined by the Constitution. So, especially as these generations reach the impactive age and get engaged politically, they are going to have a real direct impact on these issues that already the law is taking inroads on, as we see in Europe. And I'm going to talk more about Europe here in just a minute, but a couple other comments.
The problem is that the younger generation doesn't understand the Constitution. And the problem is that we allow the Constitution to be abused. It is the supreme law of the land, not a judge, not the president, the supreme law of the land. The First Amendment stands. That's the reason why we can't have, or there should never be in this country, a hate speech law. And I've been to Canada. I spent 5 months over there in Alberta and BC on oil services project that was very enlightening. The Canadians, when we went to Calgary, it was, be careful of what you say. Don't speak your mind under any circumstance. You can go to jail for it here.
Right. Yep.
Biggest target, Christian schools. The Christian school associations, Christian schools all over the country, they were losing enrollment the past 10 years. The last 3 years, they're going to be breaking at the seams because some of the parents are finally realizing what's being taught
Right.
in the so-called secular schools.
Right.
And some of these special schools they're starting have been allowed in the public dole to teach things that were never even allowed to be taught before.
Yep.
So you have young people right now in their punitive years that are actually coming up and being taught this as this is how it should be. And the generation you're seeing right now have come through that, and they're voicing that, and you see that in the environment around them. And the industries that are supported by that, the movie industry and industry, are going there too. It's dollars, pure dollars. And the rest of us, you're old school.
Well, the more stories that come out, like for example, the K-3 teacher teaching about transgenderism, I mean, my word, what in the world are you doing? You're creating psychological issues.
If
for
you
you.
pulled a textbook lately?
Yeah, my kids are homeschooled, so not recently.
I'm old enough to have some of the history in the textbook that I was in on. Doesn't resemble anything I ever saw. I was standing there.
Right.
So, wait a minute.
Yeah.
And this is being taught.
Yeah, so with the Supreme Court, and I know Kennedy and Roberts are two important votes, I mean, I know you don't have a crystal ball, but where do you think that's going to come out? And depending on where it comes out, what do you think the next steps are to do to address it? Because once the Supreme Court rules, that actually is setting a very high precedent across the country.
Right, so, you know, we had Star Parker on, and a few other people were back in DC, talked about what happened. A lot of them have positive views because of what they've heard. The reality of it is Kennedy is likely to swing vote. Kennedy is a states' rights advocate, but he's also a strong gay rights advocate. And so he's likely going to be what a lot of pundits say is a split the baby judge on this issue, probably a plurality decision, where he decides that states can determine whether or not they allow gay marriage, but if one state does allow for it, the other states have to give reciprocal respect to that decision. So effectively, that's a bunch of gobbledygook that basically says it's gay marriage 100% across the country, because obviously a small minority, if you have, for example, in Alaska, let's say the judge's decision here is set aside, we go back to the constitutional amendment, only marriage between a man and a woman, then, you know, the gay community here is going to go to Massachusetts, get married, and force recognition of that here. Effectively, it just adds a plane ticket cost, but the whole state, the whole country is going to be just as if the Supreme Court said gay marriage is universal. And so the end result of this is loss of freedom in the country. I think it's virtually, the only possible outcome that can be different is if the folk that are really engaged with what the people in this country believe, because I can tell you, what I can see on social media, I mean, it used to be that we put up a story about gay marriage on the Facebook where we got about 35,000 followers, and we get 1 or 2 shares. People would not, they didn't want to touch the issue. Now they're getting 100, 200 shares, some of them, because people are engaged and they recognize that. And I think, you know, if you don't think the Supreme Court's not political in decision making, then obviously you haven't been paying attention for the last several decades, because they absolutely are. And sometimes it's outside of politics, like John Roberts' decision on Obamacare, which just Wayne Allen Root was on the other day speculating as to why some decisions are made different than what people actually run on office or say as far as their political philosophy goes. That's a quirky one there. But the reality is that they could change the way they rule based upon the way they see this working out as far as conflict in society goes, because there's just a letter that just came out. We put this up this past week too, from a number of Christian leaders, including Franklin Graham, Governor Huckabee, and others, that said, look, this is an issue that we will not back down from. We will not obey. That was the theme of the letter. It doesn't matter what government says. This is fundamental. We will not obey. It's unconstitutional. And so with that kind of conflict brewing, the Supreme Court may recognize it because it is a political entity, and they may end up doing something different than what the pundits say. But all things equal, the way that I see that, at least at the time the arguments took place, Kennedy plurality decision is going to be gay marriage across the land by the reciprocal respect to the marriages that issue from pro-gay states.
Joe?
And let's see, we've got Lance's next there, Mike. Hold on a second.
So I was just wanted to address the one comment that I think private schools probably will go.
Lance's Religious Freedom Restoration Act, which was identical to 30 plus other states' acts, identical to the federal act. And they go out there and demonize that legislation. I just make it up, and then they had the press join directly right in with it. And the press was right on, oh, this is homophobic, oh, this is discriminatory, when it was identical to the majority of the country's laws on the books at the time. And then targeting these groups, like the pizzeria in Indiana, you know, the bakery. You just heard the administrative law judge issue a proposed $135,000 fine against this Christian baker who refused to bake a gay-themed cake. People hear that and they get pissed. I'm sorry about my language. People are angry over that, and they're finally recognizing the implications of this whole agenda And it's about putting down and putting out those that believe in traditional values, really the foundational value, because you've gotten the word out, people are understanding. If you say that the Constitution only means what the people on Black Road say it means, then it's basically the tyranny of the judiciary. It's whatever they say it is. And yet there are so many parts of the Constitution and its foundation that are understandable at face value. But we have so many things that have already gotten taken out outside of that. I mean, you have enumerated powers. Federal government gets only those enumerated powers, and yet you already have, by means of Supreme Court decision, an enormous breadth of federal power that go beyond those enumerated powers. So when people violate their oath and then they rely upon, the prior decisions, stare decisis, of the Supreme Court, they're basically saying, my oath doesn't count, or I really took an oath to the Supreme Court rather than to the Constitution. It would take probably 1 or 2 impeachments to get the federal judiciary back on track. But it's going to require the numbers to do it. You've got to have a majority vote in the House, and then you'd have to have a 2/3 vote to convict in the Senate to do it. Federal judges have been impeached. Hastings is one out of Florida, and guess what? He's now a member of the House of Representatives.
I just think that anything that we do to try and change what's going on it's going to be short term. And the reason why is because we're all older, and slowly but surely we're fading out. So anything that we're going to do long term to fix the situation, it is going to be through the youth. And part of that is getting back to the basic fundamentals being taught in school. Part of studying, bringing back government, bringing back history, and incorporating that into the school system, and not someone's perception on how it should be taught, but actually from the documents, from the book, from actual history. That's the only way to solve this issue long term, is through the youth.
Yeah, you're right, and in fact, if you look at, as mentioned earlier, I mean, many of the school books, the textbooks, I mean, consolidated, I mean, there's almost a monopolistic approach to a lot of the things that are taught in schools right now. And I mean, it's going to require a bottom-up type change where we actually, the institution, the structure has changed. He was Benjamin Watson, the NFL guy out of the Saints. We put up that Facebook post. He said, we can do all sorts of things today, and they're just going to be kind of legalistic changes until we actually have a heart change. I mean, my foundational view is that none of this matters unless we have a revival in the country. That's my personal view. I mean, all the rest of it is just window dressing, because there's got to be a change in the attitude, spirits of people in this nation. If we don't have it, we're done. And we've hit our nadir, and we're headed down, folks. And they're in absent significant fundamental change. It's just going to be, as those of you who serve in the military know, a rearguard action. And you can see it internationally already, vis-a-vis our competitors like Russia and China. I just read a story, I wanted to put it up and I couldn't find it for last night, but about one of our general senior military commanders saying that Russia today is stronger than the Soviet Union was militarily.
Yes.
So all this crap you hear about Russia on the way down and we're competitive vis-a-vis their military, they've been strengthening it, modernizing it. That's one of the reasons why they pushed so effectively in Ukraine. And it's not just on the military side, it's also on the value side. I mean, they internally look at the United States as basically a modern Rome, decaying from the inside. Here they've gone away from godless communism, and they've got all sorts of issues, don't get me wrong. The Russians have tons of issues, lots of corruption in government, everything else. I'm not putting Russia on a pedestal. But the fact is, when they have a people and they have this ability to point to the United States and suggest that there is corruption in values and everything else, and actually gain support, is one of the reasons why attitudes in Russia currently are at an all-time high as far as animosity towards the United States goes. It's as bad as it was at the height of the Cold War. And the reason is because of those kind of perceptions. There was, oh, Amy, you've been waiting patiently, sorry. You can just stand up and say, hey, you've been ignoring me.
No, everybody's important. We can't do this by politics, we can't do it by governments, we can't do it by elections. The only way we can get back our freedoms is what was founded on by the beginning of the country. Who were the people who fought? And who were the people that stood up? It was the pastors and the churches and the Christians. And if Christians and churches and pastors don't get engaged, forget it. You've got to get these youth groups, you've got to get every kind of group in a church setting, in a Christian setting, involved in this, or forget it. I don't care what you do, What does it say? Our freedom comes from God.
Amen.
And another thing, Joe did not solicit this, but I'm going to say it. Get on board and support Joe financially. Listen to his program. promote his show and his radio, because it is people like Joe that are by faith in God doing what we need. And Joe needs your help.
Well,
Do it.
we're pretty unabashed on the radio, and for those of you that think I speak politically on the radio, you haven't been listening. Because the reality is we're past the point of kind political words. It just is not going to work. And we're past the point of supporting people that are not actually fighting for our freedoms, because we can no longer conduct this losing battle. It cannot happen. There are no longer a time where we can support those even that wear the R label, that are not fighting for those values. And we, for so long as conservatives, been taken for granted. It's got to end. Okay, so Carol has not spoken yet, so we're going to go to Carol.
I just want to comment on that just a little bit. Too many times I see us conservatives shoot each other instead of forming allies with each other and recognizing, yeah, we're going to disagree on some things, but there's some basic issues we cannot disagree on. And I think we all know what those are. This is one of them. And I think it's important that we not be shooting each other, but embrace each other as allies. Because we shoot each other, we're nowhere.
Yeah, no, I agree completely, especially when you've got, and part of this also, and I wanted, this touches kind of on the edges of another thing I wanted to mention, is that a lot of times we sit back and we wring our hands and we say we just don't have many numbers. Yet, every type of political action that has ever had impact in this country, from the beginning to the end, to where we're at today, has been done by small numbers. Every solitary one. I mean, you look at this vote in Anchorage, just look at a microcosm of a political election, and the percentage of people that will actually, I'm talking about a percentage of adults that will actually determine that election, is probably 3 or 4, maybe even 2 or 3%. I mean, think about it. And the numbers that we're talking about are significant. And I think we're back, how many?
Because we shoot each other, we're nowhere.
Yeah, no, I agree completely, especially when you've got, and part of this also, and I wanted, this touches kind of on the edges of another thing I wanted to mention, is that a lot of times we sit back and we wring our hands and we say we just don't have many numbers. Yet, every type of political action that has ever had impact in this country, from the beginning to the end, to where we're at today, has been done by small numbers. Every solitary one. I mean, you look at this vote in Anchorage, just look at a microcosm of a political election, and the percentage of people that will actually, I'm talking about a percentage of adults that will actually determine that election, is probably 3 or 4, maybe even 2 or 3%. I mean, think about it. And the numbers that we're talking about are significant. I think we need to continue to fight as if the battle's not lost. It will be if we don't fight. I think we need to take the country back. If not, I mean, it's lost. I don't know how many generations we'll have left, not many, I don't think.
Yeah.
One of the things I wanted to mention, by the way, and this kind of gets to this, the perception of things. When we're here in this country and we're looking at the gay marriage argument, we see culture, we see the media just inundating us with these images of, this is accepted across the board. Internationally, it's not.
Right.
Internationally, it is not. And this is an area where, a lot of times we perceive the United Nations as being this anti-American group. We had a guest on our show last week that talked about, he works in a lot of with these NGOs against where basically the liberals of the world have consolidated the United Nations to try to impose their agenda on the rest of the world. And he said it's enormous, the opposition to gay marriage in the United Nations. And there are only 17 nations worldwide that have allowed gay marriage. There's only one that has actually done it by judicial decree, and that's Brazil. And I think he's a little off on that, because we actually have done it by judicial decree. There are 26 states whose people's wills have been overturned by the federal courts. So we're effectively the second one. So this is, again, the elites operating through the United States trying to impose this whole change of view on the rest of the world that the rest of the world is saying absolutely not. And that's an encouraging aspect of the fight. And it's also one to encourage us that this is a very small number. Even though there have been successes in changing attitudes in this country, the reality of it is still a very, very small percentage overall, and we've got to continue to push back. Well, you're exactly right. The legislature has the capacity to rein in this stuff, and of course in this state, our legislature takes this view that the courts are supreme. They're the final arbiter. They have no independent constitutional responsibility to do their part in remedying these problems. And what would happen if the legislature actually confronted the judiciary and said, we're going to refund you or something like that? The likelihood is the judiciary would go in and say, no, you will. They'll start legislating from the benches they had elsewhere. And then the question becomes as to enforcement. what actually ends up, who actually has the power of enforcement. And you know,
The-
the founders intended, I mean, with the tripartite system of government, the legislature, they all have independent constitutional purview. That was part of the weakness of the structure of government, that if you had to have all three get along to do it. And if one said no, then the other didn't do it. I'm going to stick in here because we got somebody else who's been waiting for a while.
Okay, so I think that as a society, we have a problem of not seeing the bigger picture, and we focus on what's right in front of us right now. With that being said, as I mentioned before about getting out to the youth and getting the word out to the youth, it's even bigger than that, because the youth and the younger generation is so broken because of a lack of patriotism in this country. So I think that the way to do this, I mean, it used to be that it was okay to say, hey, I'm proud to be an American, but now you say that and it's like, oh my gosh, no, whatever. And then now you have people, well, I can raise my flag. There's nothing, personally, whatever you choose to do, okay, fine. But don't take away from the patriotism that you have to this country where you're at. And once you start to build that up, then it will trickle down to our youth through society, because now they're seeing people who are proud of their country, people who respect their country, people who want to see their country thrive. And then they're going to start to want to make sure their streets are clean, make sure that they dress a certain way, because now it's being shown, instead of being bashed, oh, you can't be so proud to be an American. No, that's where it truly starts. It starts with incorporating that sense of being proud.
I think you hit the nail on the head. The left's long-term agenda is education. And Common Core is just the latest iteration of that. And if you've seen current textbooks, they're anti-American, they're pro-Muslim, they're revisionist history. As you know, a lot of textbooks, a lot of part of World War II, they don't even talk about Auschwitz. A lot of parts of World War II are omitted. And the book says that the reason that Japan attacked Pearl Harbor is because of American imperialism. You know, the reason why Hitler attacked the rest of Europe is because it was America's fault, because of our imperialistic, you know, domination. It was their response to it. So that's until the Republican Party makes it a goal to reform education like the left's done for decades, we're going to lose. You're right. Once we hit retirement age, the country's gone. So if we don't make that a core principle, I hate to use the word core from Common Core, until we make it a foundational part of the Republican Party platform, we've lost. We can win the battle but lose the war.
CC can stand for Christian Core.
There you go. Real quick, 5 more minutes of questions, and then if you want to give, if we were to elect Joe Miller president, how would you? What are the top couple things you'd focus on? So,
and that was a question I had.
2 more questions,
and
then we're
comment. As you know, even amongst the Christian community, there are lots of cross currents, and you've described the decisions that are made even by Bush appointees, and part of the cover they take is citing back to the Christian community. And I'm referring specifically to a column as an example in yesterday's ADN titled "Discrimination is Simply Not the Way of Christ," written by Matt Schultz, First Presbyterian Church, and co-authored or signed on to by 25 other pastors around the region. So I'm just wondering if you could comment with regard to how we deal with the messages of even of other Christians.
I think we appeal to the Constitution. I mean, the Constitution is the instrument by which we all unify, and the Constitution provides for fundamental rights. It provides to address these issues. I think that this, even though I disagree fundamentally with gay marriage, if you believe that that is for you, then move to a state where it's allowed. But don't trump the people's will. The people's will is very clear. I could care less whether 25 people have signed on to a letter. The fact is 70% of the state said no. And a federal judge said, I don't care. And that resonates when people understand that their will was trumped by basically the tyranny of the black robe. And that's something that I think we appeal to, is the Constitution has set up something for this country. It's a way by which a very diverse people can interact, because you are, like you said, we're going to have diverse opinions on these issues, and I think they're going to continue to increase. I don't think they're going to get less. I think there's going to be higher contrast. And I think that the founders were wise in the way they set up the system. so that if you have those type of views and you really don't feel like that they're being displayed by the people's will in the state in which you're in, you can move to another state. And like Mike said, I mean, right now the gay movement is conducting a mop-up operation. I don't know whether you realize that or not. I mean, the reason why they came out like they did against Indiana's laws, because they figured they've already won the gay marriage decision. They already read the tea leaves. They said, that's over. Now we're getting our pound of flesh. Now we're going after the Christian community that's taking a stand, unlike these other pastors that are out there that make up whatever their theology is. And look, I understand my brother he endorses gay marriage, and he grew up in the same family I did. I mean, there's significant differences of opinion on this issue. I mean, from a theological perspective, and I'm not before you as a pastor or as somebody that's going to teach doctrine, but I think the Bible's pretty darn clear on it. But you know what? I have the choice to make a decision democratically in my state as to how we're going to do that. And I can try to wage the war of opinion with you and tell you I think that the foundational family, it's a core building block to society. We need to enshrine it. We need to value it. We should not tear it down. We shouldn't be doing things that actually take away what's made America great. Instead, we ought to be encouraging it, win the debate in the civic forum, get the vote, and then, we'll see how this state sorts out vis-a-vis the other states that have taken a different direction. That's what the founders intended, laboratories of democracy, right? And yet we moved away from that, where the elites believe that they can superimpose their will on the rest of us. And they're doing not just through the judiciary, but also through culture. I mean, all you have to do is go into a theater and see it.
Go ahead, Noel. You have a question?
Yeah, I understand the Black Robe Regiment, meaning the pastors, were really critical in the Revolutionary War. And we're in a similar type of war here, as I understand it. So, is that true? Were they really? Do you think they were really instrumental in our being victorious over?
I think pastors were critical. Rafael Cruz came up for a couple of weeks this past summer and talked a lot about that. I mean, that's kind of a core part of his message. And I agree fundamentally that the pastors have a role and they've largely abandoned it. There are some that are speaking out now, and I think along with what's going on with the Supreme Court decision, people are becoming alive to what's happening. And I think that's going to create, that's part of this overreach that I talked about before. I think that the extreme left on this gay marriage issue has overreached, and they don't understand, because unlike the people that have these core convictions that are based upon their faith in part, that then exercise, and a lot of people say, oh, you can't influence the public square with what you believe. It's like, what do you mean? All laws and morality, folks. That's what it is. I mean, you're saying something's right and something's wrong. And there are different views on what's right and wrong. That's part of the reason why we have a diverse country, diverse states. It's more diverse today in some respects than what it's been in the past. But the fact is we have states where we can exercise those decisions. We can make those arguments. But the pastors are instrumental in that. And historically, they have been. Recently, there's been some concern. It's one of the reasons why the mainstream denominations are dying. The type of people that signed that letter, they are represented. I haven't seen the letter, but my guess is they're all part of the mainline churches that have been shrinking and not growing, because it's not something that is really embraced. But
Joe, what's your top 3 things you would do in Washington if you were to elect you as president?
Well, I think the judiciary has got to be brought under control. That's really a legislative act in part because of the impeachment process. But also, of course, the president, through the appointment process, can make sure that they have judges are put before the Senate for confirmation that are actually originalists. I don't know if you'd find enough now, though, today. I mean, you look at the Bar Association, and there are very few of us that are originalists that are out there. But you need to find them, because that's the most critical thing. At least if you look back and see how things have changed in this country over time, it's almost always been at the point of judicial decisions, not by legislative act. I mean, that's how the left has won. They haven't had the numbers, so they change it in ways that are undemocratic, and then proceed to convince people that that's right. I mean, Roe v. Wade is a good example, but Roe v. Wade is also an example of where, through our fight and our education, we actually are starting to swing the pendulum the other way. And now, we have, even in the youth, that this is a bright spot, despite the fact they have different attitudes on gay marriage. Largely youth are pro-life, and it's because of the effort that the pro-life community has made. So even though they do that type of thing, it's still possible to overtake or take care of restricting the growth of the federal government. All these are interrelated because the judiciary has allowed the growth of the federal government. But the growth of the federal government and the surveillance state, I mean, we have a country today that if you're an outlier, if you're somebody that's a rebel, they can take you and they can do with you as they please. A book out there called 3 Felonies a Day. Everybody commits a felony every day. If they want to selectively prosecute you, they can. We had Wayne Allen Root on the program this week, who is, again, this guy that has stood up to Obama, Columbia classmate of Obama, called out Obama about not being president at Columbia. I mean, that's just one of many different things he's done, but he's been a real pain in the butt to Obama. Well, he was audited repeatedly by the IRS, repeatedly. He ended up going to tax court apparently, got rid of the audit, and 5 days later, re-audited. And so Judicial Watch filed suit to get his IRS file. And guess what they found? It is mind-boggling. That's the way he described it this week. Fox News is breaking the story next week, but he gave us a little taste of it. But he said it was clearly a political vendetta that they found proven by the documents in his file. That's another thing. I mean, they've got to be brought under control. And the surveillance state itself is extraordinary in its growth. And it's something that if we value our freedom and we want to continue to be able to speak out, the federal government's got to be restrained. I think that the third thing is that this is one of the things presidents have not done, is they have to exercise their position as a bully pulpit. Like I said, I mean, there need to be some foundational changes in this country to get it healthy again. And we need to have real leadership in that sense. Not a top-down control type thing, but to actually say what we need to get back on track. And I think it's possible. We still got a lot of great people in this country. I mean, look at this room. It's clear full. I don't know whether you didn't expect this, but the fact of it is, if you yourselves here were active in your spheres of influence, it doesn't take large numbers, but it takes you to be bold and courageous and to speak out truth and to not back down. That's what it takes. And we can make a difference, and we will have the impact.
A special thanks to Joe for coming up. Thank you, Joe. Really appreciate it. But you know what?